There is a tribute Al Pacino wrote recently that took him several days to finish. The words were apparently harder to find than any line he has ever spoken on camera. It was written for one name on a very short, very personal list: 5 people Pacino has said actually built him. Not the awards, not the box office, just 5 people. And one of them he discovered by pure accident on a film nobody expected to matter, only to watch that discovery burn out far too soon. Pacino has never ranked these 5 for glory. He has simply told the story over and over of what each one actually gave him. Let's go through them in the order he's told it. Number 1 is Robert De Niro, for a friendship that took 21 years to actually show up on screen together. Both men appeared in The Godfather Part 2 in 1974, Pacino as Michael Corleone running the family in the present, De Niro as the young Vito in flashbacks. But their storylines never crossed. Audiences spent 2 decades assuming they had simply missed each other by a technicality of timeline. 2 of the most respected actors of their generation shared top billing on one of the greatest films ever made without ever once standing in the same room as their characters. De Niro had actually read for the first Godfather film too, before Pacino was ultimately cast in a role that didn't end up working out for De Niro at the time. By Pacino's own account decades later, there was real, sustained pressure from the studio pushing director Francis Ford Coppola to consider other actors entirely for Michael Corleone. It was pressure Pacino only fully understood much later in his life, once the 2 men had become close enough friends to compare notes on how close it all came to going a completely different way. That dynamic changed in 1995 when Michael Mann finally put them across a table from each other in Heat. Playing a relentless cop and the meticulous criminal he's hunting, they shared an iconic 6-minute diner scene shot at a real Los Angeles restaurant. It has since become a masterclass taught in film schools around the world, studied frame by frame for exactly how much tension 2 actors can generate without ever raising their voices. De Niro made one unusual request before they shot it: he didn't want to rehearse. "He's so great and he was smart because he said he didn't want to rehearse the scene with me," Pacino recalled years later. "At first I had my doubts about that, but then I realized he was right. It really made a difference and that was very clever." The gamble paid off completely. The scene plays like 2 men meeting for the first time because, in a very real sense, they were 2 actors who had spent 2 decades being compared to each other finally sizing one another up on camera with no safety net underneath them. Pacino admitted the physical demands of that same shoot caught up with him too. He injured himself during the film's climactic foot chase across an LAX tarmac, chasing De Niro's character toward the runway. "There I was in my 50s and I'm up there really about to chase this guy," he said, laughing about it decades later, still sounding a little disbelieving that he had agreed to it at all. The 2 reunited for 2008's Righteous Kill, and then again alongside Martin Scorsese in 2019's The Irishman, closing out a friendship that started on a film where they never even occupied the same frame and somehow only deepened with age. They spent 50 years being handed the exact same kinds of roles and somehow never once let that turn them into rivals instead of friends. Number 2 is Philip Seymour Hoffman. This is the one Pacino discovered before the rest of the world had any idea what they were looking at. In 1992, starring in his own long-awaited passion project Scent of a Woman, Pacino played a blind, embittered retired Army colonel opposite a young Chris O'Donnell, a role that would finally earn Pacino his first competitive Academy Award after 8 prior nominations. During filming, Pacino found himself working alongside a mostly unknown 24-year-old actor named Philip Seymour Hoffman, cast in a small supporting role as a smug, entitled prep school student named George Willis Jr. It wasn't a big part. Hoffman considered it a fairly minor gig at the time, taking it mostly because it meant he could finally quit his job at a Manhattan delicatessen and become a full-time actor. But it didn't need to be big. Critics who watched the film that winter walked out remembering Hoffman's few minutes of screen time more vividly than almost anything else in it, that particular blend of arrogance and cowardice he brought to a spoiled rich kid hanging his own friend out to dry. Director Paul Thomas Anderson said watching Hoffman in that exact film was the moment he fell in love with him as an actor, describing it later as something close to love at first sight. Anderson went on to build Boogie Nights, Magnolia, and Punch Drunk Love around Hoffman over the following decade. Hoffman himself later called Scent of a Woman his true breakthrough role, the film that let him leave the deli counter behind for good. From there, Hoffman's career only widened. He won a Best Actor Oscar for playing Truman Capote in 2005, after 4 and A half-brutal month spent studying the writer's voice and mannerisms so closely he later admitted it wasn't good for his mental health. Acclaimed turns in The Master, Doubt, and Charlie Wilson's War followed, each earning him further Oscar nominations alongside a parallel life devoted almost entirely to New York theater. He helped found the Labyrinth Theater Company in the early 90s and quietly donated hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years just to keep its doors open for younger, struggling actors, never once forgetting his scrappy roots. But the same relentless, all-in intensity that made him one of the finest actors of his generation carried a darker undertow. On February 2, 2014, Hoffman was found dead in a rented Greenwich Village apartment at 46 years old. The cause was later confirmed as a lethal speedball mixture of heroin and cocaine combined with benzodiazepines, following a relapse after more than 2 decades of hard-won sobriety. He left behind his longtime partner, Mimi O'Donnell, and their 3 young children. Pacino had given him his very first real shot in front of a camera back when Hoffman was still an anonymous face slicing meat behind a counter. He also got to watch over the next 22 years exactly how far that single shot could carry a genuinely rare talent right up until it couldn't carry him any further. Number 3 is Michelle Pfeiffer, for an audition that went sideways in the most literal way possible. When Brian De Palma was casting 1983's Scarface, Pfeiffer, only 23 and fresh off the notoriously maligned Grease 2, auditioned for the role of Elvira Hancock again and again over the course of 2 exhausting months. By her own account, she got progressively worse with every single attempt, undone by nerves and the growing certainty that she simply didn't belong in a room with a talent like Pacino's. Her first reading, done for De Palma and the casting director alone, had actually gone brilliantly. Everything after that unraveled. I just didn't have a lot of experience under my belt, she admitted decades later. I was terrified. I didn't feel worthy. I didn't feel like I had the chops. Pacino wasn't sold either. Asterisk, he just was like, she's bad, asterisk, Pfeiffer recalled without any bitterness. De Palma nearly cut her loose entirely, walking over one day to tell her gently it just wasn't going to work out, a rejection Pfeiffer said she was almost relieved to hear after months of dread. Then, a month later, unexpectedly, the call came for one final screen test, a scene near the end of the film where Elvira throws dishes across a room in a drug-fueled rage. Pfeiffer, convinced by that point she genuinely had nothing left to lose, stopped performing caution and threw herself into the scene completely for the first time in the entire process. When the director yelled cut, everyone in the room noticed blood on the floor. It wasn't Pfeiffer's. She had accidentally shattered a plate and cut clean into Pacino's hand without either of them noticing until the scene had ended. I think then he liked me, she said about it years afterward. I think that was actually the turning point. The role that had reduced her to tears most nights during the shoot became her genuine breakthrough, launching a career that would eventually include Batman Returns, The Age of Innocence, and dozens of other roles across 5 decades. The actor she had accidentally wounded during her audition ended up married to her on screen for one of the most quoted, most visually iconic films either of them ever made, a partnership that literally started in blood before it ever got to the cocaine and gunfire everyone actually remembers. Number 4 is John Cazale, the one Pacino met before either of them had anything at all, long before either man had any reason to believe acting would ever pay their rent. They crossed paths as teenage messenger boys working for Standard Oil, running errands through Manhattan office buildings years before acting entered the picture for either of them. I knew from the moment I met this guy, everybody liked John, Pacino said. You just were drawn to him because he was such an interesting person. He was so open. They lost touch for years, drifting into their own separate scrapes at survival until Pacino, cast in an off-Broadway production of The Indian Wants the Bronx in Provincetown around 1965, walked into a shared house full of actors crammed into little rooms and attics. He heard someone mention they had finally found their Indian for the play. Pacino asked who, and when the director opened a door, it was John. John, you're playing the Indian? Pacino remembered saying, stunned. That production became the hinge point of Pacino's entire career. Faye Dunaway, already a major star by then, happened to see the little off-Broadway show one night and called manager Marty Bregman and CMA head David Begelman, who both came down to see it themselves. That was the moment Pacino finally felt he had arrived somewhere real. Cazale went on to play Fredo Corleone in both Godfather films, becoming alongside Pacino one of the most quietly devastating screen presences of the entire decade. Cazale built one of the strangest, most enviable filmographies in movie history. He appeared in only 5 feature films across his entire tragically short career: The Godfather, The Conversation, The Godfather Part 2, Dog Day Afternoon, and The Deer Hunter. Every single one of them was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. It is a perfect streak no other actor in the history of film has ever matched. In the mid-1970s, Cazale became engaged to a young, then largely unknown actress named Meryl Streep. Then, in 1977, partway through shooting The Deer Hunter, Cazale was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Streep stayed by his side through the entire remaining production, reportedly taking a smaller supporting role in that same film specifically so she wouldn't have to leave him alone on set while he was still well enough to work. Cazale kept finishing his scenes anyway, visibly weaker by the week, refusing to walk away from the part. He died on March 12, 1978, at just 42 years old, months before The Deer Hunter reached theaters. He never lived to see the streak he had quietly built get completed. Pacino has spoken about him for decades since, with the specific tenderness reserved for the very first person who ever made him believe any of this was actually possible, the boy from the mailroom who became, in 5 short films, one of the most perfect actors his generation ever produced. Number 5 is Diane Keaton. This is the one still raw enough that Pacino needed several days and a film shoot in Paris he had to finish first before he could find the words at all. They met filming The Godfather in 1972, Pacino playing Michael Corleone opposite Keaton's Kay Adams. Keaton said the attraction was instant and entirely on her side at first. "I was mad for him," she told an interviewer decades later. Charming, hilarious, a non-stop talker. There was an aspect of him that was like a lost orphan, like this kind of crazy idiot savant, and oh, gorgeous. She had even asked director Francis Ford Coppola what he thought of Al after their earliest screen test together, telling him simply that she thought he was great. Their real relationship didn't ignite until they returned for The Godfather Part 2 2 years later, beginning an on-again, off-again romance that ran for roughly 15 years across multiple breakups and reconciliations. Keaton told People magazine years afterward that things ultimately fell apart because she genuinely wanted marriage and children, and he never fully committed to giving her either one, no matter how many times they found their way back to each other. They never married each other or anyone else during those years. Ended for good sometime around 1990. For years afterward, according to people close to him, Pacino lived only a few miles from Keaton in Southern California without either of them ever once picking up the phone. It was a silence he reportedly explained by saying there was simply nothing left that needed saying, that they had already said everything that mattered at the time it mattered. Diane Keaton passed away on October 11, 2025, from pneumonia at 79 years old. Pacino's tribute, when it finally came days later, read less like a formal statement and more like a man thinking out loud for the first time in decades, finally saying some of what that silence had apparently been protecting all along. "Diane was my partner, my friend, someone who brought me happiness and on more than one occasion influenced the direction of my life," he wrote. Though over 30 years have passed since we were together, the memories remain vivid, and with her passing, they have returned with a force that is both painful and moving. She opened doors for others, inspired generations, and embodied a once-in-a-lifetime gift. On screen, she was magnetic, lightning and charm, hurricanes and tenderness. She was a wonder. She lived without limits, and everything she touched carried her unmistakable energy. People will miss her, but more than that, they will remember her. She left a mark that cannot fade. She was unstoppable, resilient, and above all, deeply human. He closed with a line that felt less like a eulogy than a private confession finally spoken out loud, decades overdue. "I will always remember her. She could fly, and in my heart, she always will." Taken together, these 5 names trace the entire emotional architecture of Al Pacino's career. Not the awards or the box office, but the people who actually built him scene by scene, decade by decade. De Niro gave him a rivalry that somehow never curdled into anything but mutual respect, 2 men who spent 50 years being handed the exact same kinds of roles and simply refused to let that turn them into enemies. Hoffman gave him proof that he could still spot a once-in-a-generation talent before anyone else in the room had noticed a thing, a gift he clearly took no credit for and every ounce of quiet pride in anyway. Pfeiffer gave him a literal scar in one of the great villain romances in American film history, born out of 2 months of terror that somehow accidentally drew blood and broke the ice all at once. Cazale gave him the very first real push that got him out of a mailroom and into a life neither of them could have predicted from a shared attic in Provincetown. And Keaton gave him 15 years of love he apparently never fully replaced, followed by 30 more years of silence he never stopped quietly regretting, right up until the day there was nothing left to do but finally say so in writing.